Hey everybody, welcome into the back room. I'm Andy Ostroy. We have author Amy Littlefield with us today. We'll chat with Amy in just a moment, but first, thanks for tuning in. We appreciate you listening, and we'd love to hear your comments. So email us at backroomandy@gmail.com and or post on our social media, and we'll read some feedback next time. And if you like the podcast, please rate and review and follow or subscribe, and you'll be notified every time we post a new episode. So Amy Littlefield has reported on abortion rights for over a decade. She is the abortion access correspondent for The Nation. She has contributed to the New York Times Opinion and wrote the Times' Sunday Review cover story, Where the Pro-Choice Movement Went Wrong. She is a frequent commentator on abortion for TV and radio news outlets and podcasts, including MS Now and Democracy Now! She was a lead reporter and narrator on shows for Reveal, the national investigative journalism show. And she's with us today to discuss her latest book, Killers of Roe, My Investigation into the Mysterious Death of Abortion Rights. Amy, welcome into the back room.
Thanks so much for having me, Andy. It's great to be with you.
So congrats on the acclaim for the book, Killers of Roe, My Investigation into the Mysterious Death of Abortion Rights, the acclaim that it and you have been receiving. Tell us about it and your decision and motivation to write it and write it now.
Thank you so much. It's been really exciting to see the book out in the world. So I had been reporting on reproductive rights for several years when it became clear, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, and it became clear that we were going to lose the constitutional right to abortion, right? Because we knew Trump was going to change the makeup of the Supreme Court. That was sort of the last domino in a series of dominoes. I've been watching the anti-abortion movement assemble deliberately, really, for about 50 years. Okay. And so the thing that I understood as soon as RBG died, as soon as I started to see what was going to happen as a result, is that women were going to die, that people who needed miscarriage care, that people who needed abortions were going to die, and they were going to be forced into pregnancy against their will. And at the time, I was a new mom myself, right? I had my first kid in 2020, and it was the pandemic. And the only thing I could read was murder mysteries. It was like I wasn't sleeping very much. Like my brain was shot. There was a pandemic on. I was racked with anxiety. And then it was like the rage of understanding where abortion rights, which I'd covered for much of my career, were headed, right? And so my retreat was Agatha Christie murder mysteries. I don't think I'm alone there. I think this was like an escapism thing for a lot of us, right? Still is for me.
I'm a Dateline guy, so I understand totally what you're talking about.
Okay. Yeah, you got to have something, right? Especially if you're going to be covering the news, much less, being part of it. And so I decided to dig into the history of how we got here. Right. How we lost a constitutional right that is deeply popular. Right. Most Americans want abortion to be legal. And so how did that happen? How did the anti-abortion movement pull this off? And I was really interested in the kind of behind the scenes figures, right? The people who I hadn't heard of, even though I'd been covering this for many years. I knew about who brought the legal case and who wrote the Mississippi law and who was on the Supreme Court. But I wanted to find the kind of behind the scenes activists. The secret killers, if you'll indulge me in that metaphor. And so that's how this came about. So that's how I ended up reporting a book that tells the 50-year story of the kind of behind the scenes figures and motives responsible for the death of abortion rights. It tells the story of the lives that were lost along the way, right? This is really about people who died preventable deaths because of policies that were instituted by men who, as I learned when I spoke with them, believed that they had a direct line to God himself and were earning passage into heaven for their actions. And so it's a deeply complicated and nuanced history, and I hope it's told in a light and digestible way, even though it's very serious, because murder mysteries are my escape, and I needed that hook to kind of get myself to report this book.
Yeah, well, you frame Killers of Roe as a murder mystery, complete with unsuspected killers, multiple plot twists, surprising characters, and complicated heroes. Was it really the Agatha Christie rabbit hole that you went down that gave you the motivation to write it in this kind of a structure? And when did you realize that the story was really less about one Supreme Court decision than decades of ruthlessly calculated planning and strategy.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Yeah. I mean, I think I had been covering abortion as a news issue, right? I had been covering the day-to-day strategies around bills that were being advanced in state legislatures, around the way abortion was talked about or not talked about in elections. And so studying that sweep of history, going back to the 1970s and saying, where did this really all start? It started, actually, in my mind, the most important starting point was this policy called the Hyde Amendment that banned federal funding of abortion and cut off access for low-income people who needed abortions in most of the country. And in a way, you could say, well, that was it. Once you decided this is not something the government was going to fund, and once abortion was put into this other category in terms of health insurance for low-income people, it not only shaped access for millions of women, right, who were on Medicaid and were now going to have to raise $500 or more out of pocket if they wanted an abortion. It shaped the way that the abortion rights movement had to respond, right? Because many of the most committed, justice-oriented people in that movement were going to spend their days raising the money to give the $500 to the person who needed to be able to get an abortion and now couldn't because Medicaid wasn't going to cover it anymore. And so that was sort of my starting point. And I knew the Hyde Amendment existed. I knew it was renewed every single year, right? This is renewed every year as part of the annual appropriations process by every Congress, Democrat, Republican. It's become such a normal part of our politics. And so for me, that was the Rosetta Stone, was like, we've got to go back to that policy, understand who was responsible for that. And spoiler alert, one of the answers is a lot of Democrats, right, supported this policy. Another culprit was the Catholic Church, right? That's probably not going to surprise people
Shocker.
familiar with this history. But there were some interesting, surprising folks I met, people like Paul Herring, who I'd never heard of, not a famous guy. But he, it turned out, had written an early draft of the Hyde Amendment and had tried to sell the Catholic Church on the issue a few years before they were ready for it. And so I spent a lot of time with people like that, who were these sort of behind the scenes, who I could identify with their fire. I could identify with their commitment, and yet, obviously, I didn't identify with what they were doing. But I really wanted to understand it on a deep level. And the murder mystery paradigm really started as a way for me to sort of entice myself to tell a really complicated and challenging history. But the further I got down the road with it, the more I realized this is the right avenue to tell the story, because not only was I investigating deaths, right? The death of Rosie Jimenez, who was the first person to die as a direct result of the Hyde Amendment, the death of Becky Bell, who died because of parental consent law in Indiana. Not only was I, trying to find the hidden people behind these deaths, but I was looking for the kind of the people you wouldn't suspect, the people you didn't know about, the people who weren't making the headlines, right? Which is always the big payoff in the murder mysteries that I love best, who never see the ending coming.
Right. I believe next September is the 50th anniversary of the Hyde Amendment.
That's right.
So you mentioned the unsuspecting villains, in a sense, before. You sort of alluded to Democrats as being like people who were involved in this as well. And they weren't always the obvious villains. Who surprised you most during your reporting, and why?
Oh, what a great question. There was one super complicated, maybe I'll choose one good guy and one bad guy.
Well, that was my next
So,
question. Give me the
yeah,
bad guys. So,
yeah. I mean, so there's one man named Bob Bauman who was really surprising to me, right? He is a former congressman from Maryland. He was one of the most conservative members of Congress in the 1970s, when it turned out that he was cruising the streets of Washington, D.C., picking up young men and paying them for sex. He was gay, he was closeted, he was married, to a
what?
woman and
That's
had
crazy.
had
Another
children.
shocker.
I know. You're not going to believe this. He wasn't exceptional, right? Being closeted in Washington, right? There's whole books that have been written on that topic. But what was exceptional, right, is that he was deeply conservative and had been actually one of the behind the scenes figures responsible for the Hyde Amendment. And so when I spoke to him, I was really trying to understand the nuances of someone who, was Catholic, had found a sense of meaning and understanding for himself as a gay Catholic, but was still holding on to his conservative beliefs around abortion, right? And was very open with me about that, and reckoning, trying to ask these men to reckon with the consequences of these policies, right? Which wasn't just, over a million people being unable to get access to abortion who might otherwise have if they could have afforded it, was also about, people who have died, right? Rosie Jimenez is one that we know about who had died as a direct result of this policy. And how are these men reckoning with that? So finding him, and getting to talk to him, that was really interesting. And there were some surprises in that conversation. Um, Another one for me was Bob Packwood, right, who recently died. He was the senator from Oregon who was a pro-choice Republican, right? Someone who was beloved by feminists, right? Literally got a Good Guys Award, right, from one of the feminist organizations. I mean, Gloria Steinem was out there raising money for him. Total champion of abortion rights, introduced, bills to promote abortion rights even before Roe v. Wade. And yet, behind the scenes, he was accused of sexually harassing and accosting close to 50 women, right? And so this was like this Me Too era scandal, right? Decades ago that I think many of us who went through the Me Too era, more recently had never heard of this scandal. And so there was a lot to learn from meeting with him, which I was very fortunate to get to do. And I think I was one of the last journalists who talked to him. So reckoning with sort of the complex motives of people like that and trying to understand not just what they did, but why.
In the book, you weave together policy and history and some of these deeply personal stories. You mentioned Rosie, and I think you mentioned another woman
Becky
before
Bell.
that as well. Yeah. Was there one woman or family in particular that you write about or who you met whose experience fundamentally changed the way you think about abortion and this whole issue?
What a great question. There is one image, and it's actually a more contemporary one, that I can't stop thinking about since I read it. And it's actually from one of the ProPublica reports on the women who have died more recently because of abortion bans in states like Texas and Georgia. Right. These are laws that have made doctors afraid to treat people who are miscarrying or to treat
Right.
complications, the rare complications that people can have from abortions. Right. And so the story is about Portia Gamese, who died when she didn't get timely care for a miscarriage in Texas. She bled to death. And the story is about how, she had, I believe, two sons, but the youngest would chase after women on the street who looked like her, shouting, "That's mommy," after she passed away. And I choke up every time I hear that story, every time I think about it. And, I recently was trying to put together, because the anniversary of the Dobbs decision was in June. And so I was trying to put together an article about how many people have died as a result of the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe v. Wade. What do we know about how many people have died 4 years out from that decision? And it turns out to be an incredibly complicated question to answer, just because maternal mortality is very hard to track, and it's very hard to see increases on a population level when it's something that's relatively rare, even in the US, where we have, rates that are unjustifiably high compared to the rest of wealthy nations. And so as I was looking at that, I started to think about, what does it mean to count the dead? What does it mean to count the people who have died as a direct result of these man-made anti-abortion policies? And how really the more comprehensive and maybe accurate way to count these deaths is through stories like those, right? Through looking at what it actually means when you take away someone's mom. And these kids have to grow up without their parent, or what it means when you take away someone's, sister or daughter. Nevaeh Crane, 18 years old, what it means to her mom, to have to deal with the loss of a daughter, and knowing that death was preventable and resulted from politically motivated, religiously motivated policies. So that's a theme of the book, is sort of reckoning with, and the fact is, we can't point to thousands upon thousands of stories, because the data is very hard to get, and because those stories are incredibly hard to prove. And I talk about what it took to actually prove that Rosie Jimenez had died from the Hyde Amendment, right, in 1977, and how it took, the story actually, the way that the press was covering it at the time, it was like, oh, this is just this, Latina woman who went to Mexico for an abortion. Sometimes women do that because they're just ashamed. It was like it almost didn't get recorded. And then
Mm.
two white feminists who had a whole problematic, backstory of their own, and I unpack all of that in the book. But to their credit, went to Texas, to the Texas-Mexico border, to this town of McAllen, and proved no, Rosie Jimenez did not go to Mexico. She had her abortion right in the United States, and it happened as a direct result of the Hyde Amendment. So they had to talk to her friends. They had to, collect all of that information to be able to prove it. And so, but my argument is sort of that these small, limited number of stories that we do have should be enough, right? Should be enough to repeal these policies.
Well, it's interesting what you're saying because, like, all we have to do is look back a few years to COVID and how the government was like, they didn't die of COVID, they died of pneumonia,
Right.
and
Right.
and they would have died and so those in power can use these tactics to skew the numbers however they want.
That's right. And when it's abortion, it's, she didn't die from an abortion. She died from, having sex outside of marriage or for, killing her baby, right? Is the way that the anti-abortion, it's like
Yeah.
it's that person did something wrong. But yeah, you're absolutely right. These deaths can be litigated by all sides, and they are. And for the anti-abortion movement, it never, a woman's death from an abortion ban is never as significant as the, unborn babies in their mind that they feel like they have saved. And so the math of abortion rights has always been very skewed and complicated
Well, it's
throughout this
also
history.
it's the thing that I've always been angered by over the years is the inherent hypocrisy and inaction, forcing the bringing of babies into the world and then just completely not giving a fuck about them once they're born.
That's right.
And having a platform that literally does everything humanly possible not to support the mother and especially this child who you put such a high value on, that you don't care if women die because of your political legislation. It just, I mean, why do you think they are so obsessed with this issue?
That was one of my central driving questions, right? Is like a genuine desire to understand that very question, right? Like
Yeah.
why? Um, and I think it's complicated, right? I'm not going to paint everyone with a broad brush, but some of the answers I found when I dug into that, right? I mean, I think you'll find the true believers, right? And so I talk about this alliance of true believers and political opportunists that were needed to bring about the end of abortion rights. Some of the true believers were devout Catholics or Christian evangelicals who genuinely believed. And I think some of the Catholics, it was like, this is a top-down religion, right? You take your words from above. The Catholic Church says abortion is wrong, and they took that very seriously. And they believed that by fighting abortion, they were going to earn their way into heaven, and they were going to do what the God of their understanding wanted them to do. And when I would ask that question directly to some of these men, whether it was Paul Herring or Bob Bauman, who were the kind of hidden architects of the Hyde Amendment, or Randall Terry, more recently the fiery militant anti-abortion activist who launched Operation Rescue and used to lead hundreds of people to blockade abortion clinics in the 80s and 90s. They gave a similar answer, which was like, well, I hope when I get to the gates of heaven, it's on my list of achievements. And so there was this sort of almost transactional answer that I got. I think there's a different layer to your question too, though, which is like, why do they care about the fetus so much? Right?
Or,
Or
yeah,
like,
I mean, it's like you can care and you can
yeah,
have beliefs,
yeah,
but why do you need to control my body?
yeah, yeah. And I think, I mean, abortion is Kristen Luker, the sociologist, wrote a book about abortion and how it's sort of a referendum on motherhood, right? Like how it's a stand-in for sort of the way that our culture and politics negotiate different interpretations of what mothers are and should be, right? And so, for Christian conservatives, it's like motherhood is easy and breezy, and you wear your linen dress and you bake your sourdough bread and you you know, have 7 kids. And like the left likes to complain about motherhood and they want you chained to your desk and aborting your babies. And so part of it is this sort of like different cultural, the way that we
Yeah.
negotiate and understand like what motherhood and family making are, right? And another part of it that I really didn't understand until I dug into the history of the book is that I think there is like a genuine commitment to the unborn baby, as they would understand it, or fetuses or embryos as science would understand it, right? And it stems from when you look at the trajectory of the anti-abortion movement and when the sort of modern day iteration of it originated, it really came out of this reaction to the civil rights movement and to feminism. And this era when not only did you have women asserting their reproductive rights and their right to work outside the home, and those two things being quite integrally related, but you had Black Americans calling attention to white supremacy, right? And so for white conservatives who really didn't want to look white supremacists in the eye and also were angry about the fact that all these women were, having abortions and working outside the home, the anti-abortion movement really served this dual purpose, right? Which was not only pushing back against the gains of second wave feminism and saying abortion is murder and women who have them are doing something wrong. It was this ability to sort of to say we're going to kind of build our own parallel civil rights movement, and we're going to steal the moral righteousness and the fire of the Black-led civil rights movement, and we're going to use the same terminology. We're going to talk about the right to life. We're going to talk about the fetus as this innocent victim, this martyr who's being killed by the culture, and we're going to defend it. And historian Jennifer Holland writes about this, about how this sort of civil rights movement for fetuses or a civil rights movement for white people like grew out of this response to not just Roe v. Wade, but to civil rights, right? And I think that really helped me understand how integrally connected this history is to the backlash against, civil rights, not just feminism, right? Which is maybe a more like intuitive connection when you're talking about abortion rights, but it's all intertwined. And so I did find like a genuine commitment to it among some of the rank and file activists. And I tried to spend a lot of time sitting with and understanding where that came from, where that, grew out of for them. And then how they built the political alliances that they needed to actually make that into policy that would be imposed on the rest of us.
Does it make you feel, because that was my next question, is like after all the years of interviewing some of these folks and hearing their reasoning, like it's almost like January 6th, where like a lot of us start off thinking, oh, these are animals, these are thugs, these are criminals. And then you start to realize, actually, I think they were the patriots. They thought
Absolutely.
they were defending because the president of the United States was telling them that, right? So I wonder if like here, it's like, all these years, people like me and you and others, we loathe these people who want to control other people's bodies and beliefs. But I was wondering if part of that for you had changed once you got to understand them a little better. Does it make you less angry about their approach to things or not?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I would say reporting this book changed me a lot, listening deeply to the people I disagreed with, to the people whose views
Mm-hmm.
I find reprehensible,
Mm-hmm.
to the people whose views I find racist, sexist, all of the things, right? It changed my understanding of their movement. It
Mm-hmm.
deepened my understanding of history and of how we got to where we are. It definitely didn't make me less angry. That is one thing it sure did not do. I am still so angry. I am angry that people cannot get the care that they need. I am angry at how disproportionately these restrictions fall on the very people who can least afford to have another hurdle in their lives, right? How disproportionately this impacts people of color, low-income Americans. That has been true throughout history, right? It is true today. And so this probably made me angrier, if anything, but it did deepen my understanding. And that's why my argument is like, I really do. I mean, I don't think everyone has to sit for hours and listen to people on the other side. But I guess I feel like, especially as a cis white woman who can show up in these spaces and blend in a way that gives me an identity crisis every time, right? When I went to the Moms for Liberty conference several years ago, and all it took is just like I put on the right dress and some makeup and I go, and no one gives me a second look. And then there were protesters outside, and I was like, my people, and they were like, who are you? You like, you've got this Moms for Liberty badge on, and I was like, no, I write for the nation, like please. So, I can go in there and I can feel safe, in those spaces in a way that a lot of people of color or, people who are trans, like people who are visibly part of the communities that white conservatives deride, can't do. And so I sort of see this as like something I can go in and listen and bring back and share. And that's sort of my contribution to the movements that I do believe in that are fighting for social justice. And so that's what I was trying to do here, to go back through history, to interview these people, to try to, get their side of the story and then reconcile that with my understanding of what really happened, and present a richer understanding of people who I do think we tend to sort of dismiss or not want to listen to or see as just like, okay, they hate us, right? Like they hate women, they hate Black people, they hate trans people. Okay, let's understand how we got here, why. Let's unpack that a little bit. Is there anything, like I wanted there to be something more interesting than that, right? Something more compelling. And in a lot of cases there was. And I think there is a mandate in this moment, for us to all understand how we got here and who these people are, if we're gonna find a way out of it, right? And understand, for me, understanding the motives, right? Like understanding that the 80-something-year-old man sitting in front of me was once a like young boy running through a big front yard in Texas, being told by a devout mother that he loved that if he behaved himself, one day he was going to meet her again in heaven. Like, if I try to apply that understanding, I start to see a human being in front of me, right?
Right. Well, that's what I was
all of these things. Yeah.
getting at, because, like, I guess my question, to qualify it a little bit more, was not so much the leadership of the church or the synagogue or Washington, D.C., it's just people at home who may be in one way or another manipulated or indoctrinated over the years into this convoluted way of thinking. Like, I almost wish there was a test case that would go all the way to the Supreme Court where a pregnant woman, a newly pregnant woman, argues in court that she shouldn't have to pay her ticket for being in the HOV lane by herself because she actually has another human being with her, right? Because we're all told life begins at conception, right? It's not a zygote or a embryo or a fetus. It's a human being. Well, the sign says 2 or more people and you're good, right? So why wouldn't that apply? I would love to see the arguments that people make, like, no, it's in your body in a car, it's not a human, but when it comes to us telling you can't get an abortion, then it's it would be fascinating to me to see how that would, even with a conservative Supreme Court, how that would navigate its way through the judicial system.
I would be very interested in that too. I have to say, that's a creative idea. And hey, why should we let the other side have all the creative ideas, right? I mean, some of them have got to go.
Yeah, we can manipulate people too. Your reporting suggests that the anti-abortion movement succeeded, perhaps in large part, because it played the long game. Speak to that a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, this was 50 years, right, of having a focus on a single target, which was Roe v. Wade, right, of saying we are going to take down this Supreme Court decision granting the nationwide right to legal abortion. And it was so incremental. It was so step by step. And some of it was luck, right? Let's be honest. If certain
Mm-hmm.
Supreme Court justices hadn't died right when they did, you
Mm-hmm.
know, we might not be where we are.
Right.
Some of it was luck. Some of it was missteps made on the Democratic side, made by the pro-choice movement, and I reckon with all of those too, right? Um, some of it was really clear-headed, smart strategy that was very local, that was very incremental, right? Um, I mean, after 2010, when the state legislatures, there's this backlash to Obama's election as the first black president. You have the Tea Party movement surging, and a lot of state legislatures changed from Democrat to Republican, right? And you start to see this enormous surge in anti-abortion bills. And there's this sort of just like, let's try everything. Let's try all these, your idea. It's like, let's put the HOV lane and the lady and but it's like, let's come up with, ultrasound requirements and 72-hour waiting periods and 48-hour waiting periods and, read this crazy script aloud to the, person having the abortion and it was like so intense and so small and so state level, which made it really challenging to sound the alarm about it, right? Because it was this like emergency that was happening, through one bill in the North Carolina legislature this day and one bill in, the Texas, 40 bills in the Texas state legislature, another day. And it made it really hard because it felt to the people who were defending abortion rights like sort of a constant state of crisis. And then a lot of it was in the courts, right? And so and there was this dependence, I think, by the pro-choice movement, which is one of the missteps, on the courts being this backstop that we're going to uphold what had been a court decision originally, Roe v. Wade, which, worked as a strategy for a long time until it didn't. But I think, and I think the other thing to really understand about the anti-abortion movement's strategy that maybe is only clear in retrospect, because I don't necessarily think there was a mastermind being like, here's how we need to do it, right? Um, they had this incremental strategy, right? Passing anti-abortion laws, most of them at the state level. The Hyde Amendment, which was a federal policy, was the first, major example that I look at and sort of the Rosetta Stone. Incremental chipping away at abortion rights that stigmatizes abortion, that silos it off from the rest of healthcare, that keeps it a salient issue for Republicans, especially at the state and local level. But you also had other strategies that were often divisive, that were often in conflict, right? The rescue movement being one of them, where you have Randall Terry firing up all these evangelicals to lay their bodies down in front of abortion clinics, and they get carted dead weight off to jail, and the jail cells are filled with hundreds of white people who are cosplaying as civil rights activists, and they all bond together. And and that movement actually was at odds often with the mainstream anti-abortion movement, which wanted to be more incremental, which was building alliances with Republican politicians. And yet, somehow, in retrospect, those divisions can sort of look like strengths because you can see how the more militant wing in the movement was terrorizing abortion providers and, shutting down clinics and putting abortion on the nightly news and making it look like this really controversial topic, even though most Americans have for a long time wanted it to be legal. You can sort of see how these different strands all conspired together to get us where we are today. Now, no one totally planned that, right? That I know of. No one said to Randall Terry, like, "Hey, here we need both of these things," and yet you can see how that strategy was really successful in retrospect. And one of the hard truths to admit in reporting this book is that the anti-abortion movement was a really strong grassroots movement, right? It wasn't just a bunch of masterminds at the Alliance Defending Freedom cooking up a legal strategy. It wasn't just Leonard Leo and the Federalist Society figuring out how to rearrange the right Supreme Court justices to, and funding, right, and all of their money to make, that project happen. A lot of it was grassroots activists who were coming up with these ideas, who were developing these strategies, who were executing these experiments in real time to see, is this, law to require a transvaginal ultrasound going to work? Oh, people don't seem to like it. Well, let's phrase it this way, and that was a lot of grassroots involvement, right? And my theory of history is that it's not brought about by the most powerful, well-funded people, exclusively. That real people mobilizing the streets, mobilizing in state legislatures, working hand in hand, that's how change happens, right? And
Right.
so I was interested in seeing how that played out on this issue, including on the side that I disagreed with, right? And giving them some credit for, building a really, really robust grassroots movement that frankly out-organized the abortion rights movement at pretty much every stage of this history.
One of the more provocative ideas in the book is that some of Roe's demise can be traced to compromises made by abortion rights supporters themselves. Where do you think the pro-choice movement miscalculated or just plain screwed up?
Yeah. I think there are several things, right? I was just speaking about the state level ground game and how much of the anti-abortion movement strategy was in the states. I think the pro-choice movement and progressives writ large have always neglected the states, right? Have always focused more on DC, on federal policy. I think you see with a lot of abortion rights groups after Roe v. Wade, there was this like, we're going to set up shop in DC or New York. We're going to focus on federal policy. We're going to focus on shoring up Roe. And there was a disinvestment from especially red and purple states, which became these laboratories for anti-abortion policies. Now, when I talk to people in the movement, I talk to many, many, many dozens of abortion rights activists and advocates and experts and legal strategists and ask them some version of this question of like, what are the mistakes that keep you up at night, right? And you'll find people who are like, we should have fought harder in the states, right? I even, people who were leaders of NARAL who are like, yeah, I probably should have done more to help those state-based, organizations and to have more of a local ground game. And then you'll talk to people who are like, we forget it. We shouldn't have had a state level ground game at all. We should have just focused on the courts. We should have only, for the courts are the only thing that matter. And, so obviously the movement is still reckoning with that question. You don't have a loss like losing Roe v. Wade and not, reckon deeply with all of the different missteps along the way. I think another major issue, right, is the racial divisions within the abortion rights movement and the fact that a lot of it was white-led, a lot of it focused on the single issue of abortion, whereas you had Black women sounding the alarm about forced sterilization, about, the jailing of people for suspected drug use, about a whole range of interconnected issues that are part of the reproductive justice framework, the right to not just to have an abortion, but to have children and to raise those children in safe communities, and saying your pro-choice movement doesn't speak for us and isn't meeting the needs of our, lived experiences, right? Something Sarah Matheson points out in her book, Reproduction Reconceived, is that Roe v. Wade happens in 1973, sort of at the very moment when you have the decimation of the social safety net, the rise of mass incarceration, all of these different forces coming into play that make the idea of choice sound completely meaningless to portions of the population, right? If your partner is in jail or you're in jail or, you're in immigrant detention or or you don't have the money and your food stamps have just been cut, like what does choice mean, right? And so this framework that I think often sounded good in Washington or sounded good to some of the middle-class white women who were coming up with these strategies, like didn't always resonate with people's lived experiences, especially for women of color. And that made it hard to build an intersectional grassroots movement of the kind that I think would have been needed to push back against policies like the Hyde Amendment in a more robust way.
The Supreme Court overturned Roe in June of 2022. Yet turnout by young voters and women in that year's midterms and the 24 election failed to live up to the predicted Roevember, right? The Roevember backlash and the expectations that were going to come from that. But in fact, Republicans took control of the House in 22. How do you explain all that? What happened? Where was the outrage? Where was the rushing to the polls to take back Washington and codify Roe? And all? It just was like, it seemed to me that people were just like deflated. They gave up.
Well,
Okay.
I think the answer on that is complicated, right? the one way to measure abortion as a political issue is to look at ballot initiatives, right? And
Hmm.
so after Roe v. Wade fell, there was a record number of abortion ballot initiatives. Most commonly, almost always, the pro-choice side of that wins,
Right.
regardless of where you are. And I think that is a testament to people when they are given the opportunity to vote directly on the issue, right? And I spent my election night 2024 in Amarillo, Texas, which is a chapter in the book, right? One of the reddest pockets of the country where abortion was directly on the ballot. There was a so-called travel ban, right? It was what the opposition called it, but a ban that would have prevented people from driving through the Texas Panhandle to leave the state for an abortion, um, or tried to do so. And Amarillo, Texas rejected it, right? They voted for the pro-abortion rights side of that. They also voted for Donald Trump, right? And so
Hmm.
if you can understand that puzzle, you can understand what is going on with abortion in as a political issue in the United States, which is that it doesn't always sway the candidate that people vote for. It is a truly bipartisan issue. There are a lot of Republicans, especially Republican women, who want abortion rights to be legal, who see it as a matter of personal liberty, who have lived experiences with IVF or with miscarriage that make them um, vehemently opposed to abortion bans. What I think we see time and time again is it's not enough to change the candidate that somebody votes for. And I also think there is coming back to the earlier point about the choice framework, right? I think we started to see after the fall of Roe v. Wade, Democrats really talking about abortion rights for the first time. And so it was like, okay, Democrats have embraced abortion as a talking point, and now we're going to see if it changes the outcome of the elections, and when Kamala Harris won, oh God, can you tell I'm still wishing for it?
Yeah.
Kamala Harris lost anyway in
Yeah. She
2024.
she lost, Amy.
God
We
damn
have to
it.
let go. She
I thought,
lost.
who's the president right now, Andy? Um,
It's that
I have,
guy.
it's that guy.
The guy, the one, the convicted felon accused of sexual assault by over 20
Uh,
women, who's in the Epstein files, accused of raping and physically assaulting a 13-year-old girl. Like that
oh
guy
my God. Wait,
was
he's the
chosen
president?
again with all that
Oh,
knowledge. See,
yeah.
that's the
Okay.
crazy
All
thing.
right. Yes. Yeah, it does sound bad when you put it that way. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it is pretty bad. I guess, one explanation that I have, and having spent like a lot of time talking to white women who voted for Trump and yet are pro-choice or pro-abortion rights or don't think their daughter or themselves, should have, political mandates for what to do with their bodies, trying to solve this puzzle. Um, it did make people angry. And it was not the only thing happening in people's lives. And the third point I want to make here, which is about the Democrats, is that I don't think Democrats have found a way yet, at least most Democrats have found a way to talk about abortion rights that actually resonates with people's real lived experiences, right? The fact that abortion was siloed off from the rest of healthcare, that it was siloed off or, attempted to be siloed off from, miscarriages, from birth control, from IVF, from the right to have a family, was a legal right decision, not because that's how people actually live our lives, right? The same person who has a miscarriage has a baby the following year. The same person who has an abortion has a baby 10 years later. These are not separate experiences. And
Mhm.
often the way that people live and talk about these experiences are as economic issues, right? Like abortion is a kitchen table issue. It is an issue that partners sit around the table and debate. Do we have the money to be able to afford a child that we may want or not want, right? It's all intertwined in people's lived experiences. And I think all too often choice is still talked about as this, siloed off issue that is, part of the culture wars and separate from economic concerns, separate from things like housing, separate from things like incarceration. And the reality is like, it's not. It's not. This is all part of the framework of people's lives. And so I think, it's not necessarily connecting the way that Democrats are talking about it. But I mean, I do think that you see the evidence of the outrage and how it can move the needle in the way that it is treated at the state and local level. And I do think one of the silver linings of Dobbs, if we can say that there have been any, is that it has renewed the focus by Democrats and progressives on state and local politics, because that is where this change gets made, right?
Mm-hmm.
Abortion has always been shaped in the states. So many issues in our lives are, right? Education, housing, these are all shaped at the state and local level. And so I think there is an understanding of that. And I think we'll see the salience of this issue again in 2026, not just with the, 4 or so states that are going to have abortion on the ballot directly, but also in the way that state and local candidates are talking about the issue. And in the way that people are living the experiences of dealing with abortion bans. I mean, I think that's the other thing. Right after the Dobbs decision, I think there was a huge amount of outrage over the symbolism of Roe v. Wade being overturned. But now we're 4 years out, and what do we have? We have stories of people who are miscarrying being carried to a neighboring state by helicopter so that they can get adequate treatment. We have parents. I just talked to a family yesterday in a state that's getting involved in a state that's going to have abortion on the ballot in the midterms. And they got involved because their daughter had a non-viable pregnancy and had to leave the state to get an abortion, right? And mom and dad are flying with her to be there by her side. And, dad, who was a registered Republican, is getting involved and gathering signatures to put this issue on the ballot. And so I think it's a slow burn in terms of the political impact as well. I don't think 2022 was ever going to be the peak of it, because each day more stories emerge about people dying preventable deaths from not getting miscarriage care in time, and when that person, or that's your neighbor, or that's somebody in your state, or if you're like me and you're haunted by the story of what happened to Portia Gamazzi and her son chasing after women who look like her on the street, then this is not going away as a political issue that has salience.
My last question, and it sort of is the flip side to the earlier question about understanding the mindset of others. If someone who strongly opposes abortion reads your book, what do you hope they take away from it?
Yeah, I think they're out there. I know that there was a post on National Right to Life News by someone being like, "Oh, I don't know. I'm not going to agree with this book, but I'm definitely going to read it." I think he wrote a couple posts about like, I'm not going to agree with this book, but I'm definitely going to read it. I'm like, all right, great, read it, please buy a copy. Let me know what you think. I think they'll learn a lot about the history. I think they'll learn a lot about the deadly ramifications of their policies. I hope they will learn something about the humanity of the people they disagree with. I sat and really tried to deeply understand the humanity of the people I disagree with. And I think that was informative. It did not soften my stance. It did not make me less angry, but it did make me understand better, how do we defeat these human beings who came up with these policies. And I think also, I hope, many of them might know this, but some of them might not, that they'll understand to what extent Roe v. Wade was a copycat killing, right? They copied the playbook of the civil rights movement and reverse engineered it, right? They took the rhetoric, they took the imagery. I mean, the number of times I heard people refer to themselves totally unashamedly as Martin Luther King Jr. himself, right? Because they're defending, the fetus, right? And this sort of rhetoric of the white people's civil rights movement. It's overwhelming. It's shameless and offensive, and yet it worked. And so,
Do you think you change anybody's mind? And the second part, I actually lied. That wasn't my last question. This is my last question. Do you think it changes anyone's mind? But do you think more so that the book should serve as a lesson for Democrats about other issues that could be coming down the road, marriage equality, and how to prevent this from repeating itself with some other right that could be taken away from us?
Yeah, I think absolutely. And when you said marriage equality, I mean, it's like it's these pinch me moments where you're in, right? Where it's like, right, we're having like the conservative movement right now is having a debate about whether women should be allowed to vote. Okay, like that's where we are, right? This is this is how far the Overton window
So
has
they're
moved.
smart. They're doing it indirectly,
Yeah.
the Save America Act.
Yeah.
But the way it's written does
Right.
it is a lot of risk for women because of name changes when they get married, things like
Exactly.
that. The possibility of them not being able to vote on election day if they're not
And
informed and
hey,
took care of it before then.
if Dobbs is not a salient issue anymore, why are they so scared of women voting? I would ask.
Well, they're
But
scared of everything. They're scared of This is my conclusion to the conservative. Stop being so damn scared of everything that breathes that doesn't look or sound like you. You might get through your day a little bit less stressed.
Is that
That's
what we
my-
want? Anyway, you asked a question at some point in there.
Yeah. Well, it's about the lesson that Democrats
The
should
lesson for
learn
Democrats.
from
Yes.
this,
Yeah, yes, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the main takeaways for me is that you do not get anywhere without a grassroots movement composed of true believers. You cannot get somewhere just on, by electing political leaders or appointing the right, justices on the court. That is not enough to meaningfully change the arc of history. You have to build grassroots movements, and people in power respond to those movements and they get their ideas from those movements. And I think that is a hard truth to admit for those of us who support abortion rights, right? That the anti-abortion movement actually did a really good job of building a grassroots movement that would put pressure on people in power. And so I think, my lessons, and I hope it's an encouraging and a hopeful takeaway from the book, actually, to say, like, no, you can get involved at a grassroots level in this issue. You can get involved with your local abortion fund that's counteracting the Hyde Amendment by paying for people's abortions. You can get involved in what's going on in your state legislature. My state here in Massachusetts just repealed or just eased the restrictions on abortions later in pregnancy. And so things are happening in state legislatures. The fact that states, including Massachusetts, have passed shield laws that protect providers here who are shipping abortion pills into states like Texas. Well, that's meant that the number of abortions has gone up, right? That's one major factor in how abortions have gone up since the Dobbs decision, right? And so what's happening at the state and local level is really, really important. And I do think there's a growing recognition of that now. That's partly come about as a result of the Dobbs decision.
Yeah, people have the power, right? It's all down to the people, and in large part on election day. I say this all the time, and I'll keep saying it. It's the one day of the year where the janitor and the billionaire have the same exact power. And the more people understand that and understand the power that they have to impact the local and city and state level, not just national politics, but everything from your school boards, which is all part of the Republicans' long game as well.
Yeah.
The more people understand that, the greater the chance turnout will be more than 55 or 60%, which it typically is, and which is pretty sad. Amy, thanks so much for coming on. Good luck with the book, Killers of Roe. And you'll have to come back when you do your next book.
That would be great. Thanks so much for having me, Andy. It was a great conversation.
Take care. This episode was produced and edited by me, Andy Ostroy. It was co-produced by Matty Rosenberg and Jen Hammoud for Radio Free Rhiniecliff, with additional editing by Matty Rosenberg, music by Andrew Hollander, and graphic design by Cricket Lengyel. And with a special thanks to our sponsor, The Epicurean. Again, thanks for listening. Please rate and review wherever you get your podcasts, and subscribe to the Backroom with Andy Ostroy YouTube channel, where you can watch full videos of our interviews. See you next time.